Thanks. I'm really excited to be here at St. Paul's. I think this school has taken an enormous creative leap in establishing International Baccalaureate in the way that it has. Um, Along with your international primary curriculum in the elementary school, the Japanese program, and what I saw of the STEM club this afternoon in Mick Scott's class, there are things happening here that I haven't seen in any other independent school, and I think this is really a special place to be. I'm going to talk a lot about IB here, but I think you have lots of reasons to be happy with what's going on here. Journalists, I think, are like parents, and I'm going to talk tonight both as a parent and as a journalist. I think we tend to jump into things. We try to read all the books as parents, and then we have to do new things that our kids are getting into that we aren't familiar with. We jump in, we try to keep our eyes open, we try to see what's what. Sometimes we make mistakes, sometimes we embarrass ourselves for our kids or ourselves, but it's that parental desire to find out what's going on that I think motivates journalists too. And I have a lot of experience with jumping into things and making errors as a reporter. My favorite example is a story, not about me, but about another reporter. It happened when my wife Linda and I were correspondents, one of the first newspaper correspondents in Beijing in 1979, and a lot of American reporters were coming in for the first time, and all of us were very eager and trying things where we could. And one of our colleagues, I had spent a lot of time learning Chinese before I got to Beijing, but a lot of the American reporters coming in didn't know much Chinese, and he came in. We all lived at the Beijing hotel, and he went to the front of the hotel and summoned one of the cab drivers to give him a lift, and this was before the cab drivers in Beijing were speaking much English, and he got in the back of the cab and said to the cab driver, I want to go to the best Peking duck restaurant in town, and the cab driver didn't understand English, didn't know what he was saying, and so he thought about this for a minute, and he got a really good idea, and he motioned to the cab driver to look at him, and he went like this, and the cab driver took him immediately to the airport. That's the way things go in journalism often. My wife and I have been parents for a long time. We have 3 kids. They're all grown up now, and we've been both public school and private school parents. The private schools our kids attended were 2 of them in Pasadena, California, the Chandler School, which is a K-8 that overlooks the Rose Bowl, and I think one of the best of the 3, I think, because it had the kind of values that I see at this school. Great teachers who know that you're teaching kids not only how to learn, but how to live. A connection to sports, which I think is really important, and just the kind of ethos that you want in education. 2 of our sons also attended the Pasadena Polytechnic School, which is across the street from Caltech and has a fine, high tradition of learning. And then our youngest child spent several years at Sidwell Friends, which is the most famous of the private schools our children have attended. And I have some problems with Sidwell Friends. I'll get to that, and we'll explain in some ways one answer to my question of if IB is so great, why don't all schools, particularly the famous ones like Sidwell Friends, have it? And I'll have some interesting answers for that. So let me take you on the journey that I have gone through as a parent and particularly as a journalist. I've had the great fortune to work for the Washington Post, which has the resources to let a reporter like me really spend 30 years getting in deep into something that very few reporters ever get to do. My journey has been what makes a good school. What are the best schools, and how can we have more of them? Throughout that journey, I spent a lot of time looking at things other than IB, but once I got to IB, I saw that this really encapsulated all that I was looking for in terms of what defines a great school. So let's talk. As I say, I jump into things, and so my story begins by jumping into something in 1982, December 7th of 1982. I'll give you the exact date because it all started with a newspaper article. There was an article in the lower right-hand corner of the Metro section of the Los Angeles Times. I was then the LA bureau chief of the Washington Post, which sounded like a very important job. It was actually just me in a little office with the secretary, but I tried to be as important, sound as important as possible so people would return my phone calls. And that morning, I was reading the LA Times, doing things that correspondents for big important newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal do all the time when they're based a long way from their home offices. I was reading the local newspapers and looking for stories that I could steal. Now, steal is a harsh verb. I was looking for stories that local stories sort of had missed the point, that if I imposed my cosmic Washington Post brilliance on this little story, I was going to turn it into something that would appear on the front page of the Post, which was my object in life. I'm an arrested adolescent. I got into journalism because I wanted to see my name in the paper. I've refused all efforts to make me an editor because that would cut me off from that chance of seeing my name in the paper. And that was that. So that's what I was doing this day. And this story attracted my attention because it said that 14 kids at a high school in East Los Angeles, Garfield High School, had taken and passed the advanced placement calculus test and then been accused of cheating on that test and had been forced to take it again, and they'd all had good scores again, showing that the accusation of cheating had to be wrong. It was written as a political story, these poor Mexican-American kids against the Educational Testing Service of Princeton, New Jersey, which was a nice contract. And I knew the reporter was he was a political reporter for the LA Times, and obviously they couldn't find any education reporters in the newsroom that day. We education reporters have gotten very good at either staying low when we're in the newsroom and people are looking for assignments, or calling from outside saying we're at a school. Nobody ever knows where we really are. But this story, interests me because it failed to answer two important questions. One, did you get even one kid at that school taking AP Calculus and passing it? This is one of the poorest schools in America, 85% free and reduced lunch. How could you get one kid there? And what had the teacher done to cause all these kids to learn AP Calculus? So I got in my car and went off and found the teacher who was responsible for this. He was up on the third floor of this huge school. His name was Jaime Escalante. He was fat, balding, Bolivian immigrant. He later became famous. They made a movie about him in 1988, a movie that those of you who are on Netflix, you might order. It's a really great movie about how a school gets better. It's called Stand and Deliver. But back then, nobody had ever heard of Jaime, and nobody had ever heard of his story. And as he began to tell me what he did, I got more and more perplexed and amazed, because he was doing things and making challenges to low-income kids that I didn't think were possible, and that most Americans didn't think were possible. In fact, at that stage, and I think even now, most American teachers didn't think were possible. So I hung around that school for 5 years, eventually wrote a book about it, trying to figure out how he could advance these low-income kids whose parents never got beyond the 6th grade to passing AP Calculus. And at the end of that 5 years, I developed this factoid that really changed my life. In 1987, 5 years after I started investigating Garfield High School, that school had 129 kids taking an AP Calculus. Their passing rate was about 70%, which was above the national average. But that wasn't the real factoid that got me. The real factoid was that in 1987, 26% of all the Mexican Americans in the country who took AP Calculus exams, 26% of all the Mexican Americans in America who took and passed the AP Calculus exam were students at Garfield High School. 1/4 of all the Mexican Americans in the country who passed that exam were at that one high school. And my first thought was, gee, that's a great, testament to what Jaime and his co-teacher Ben Jimenez did for those kids. But the second thought was more depressing. If they could do that at that school and produce that many kids, why couldn't all the teachers in the hundreds of other schools, like low-income schools like Garfield, bring their kids to that level? What was magic about what was going on at Garfield? And that has been what I've been trying to find out for the last 30 years. There were 5 things that were going on at that school, which, if you'll listen carefully, are very close to things that are going on at this school, in part because the school is so good, and in part because you are so good as parents. You've given kids the kind of background that kids need, and a lot of kids at places like Garfield don't get and have to be supplied by the teachers. High expectations for every one of those kids at Garfield. That was terribly important. Jaime didn't think low-income Mexican kids were too poor or too disadvantaged to learn. He just thought they, like all teenagers, were lazy, and he was going to fill up their time with learning. High expectations, number two, extra time for learning. I mean, at this school, you do it because you're all making sure kids do their homework. Jaime made sure that kids do their homework by inviting them all to come into his class at 3 o'clock and stay until 6. And if you weren't doing the homework, he made you want to be in his class at 3 o'clock and stay till 6, or your life would be miserable. Take testing seriously. I'm going to get to the importance of the IB exam, the best exam we give in high schools in our country now. But in that case, he had the AP exam, and he took it seriously. A lot of people talk about we're testing kids too much, we're teaching the tests. That's not a really helpful attitude if you want to raise the level of kids' achievement. You have to, if you have a good test, you should test to it, since that's your whole purpose is to learn something and review, which is what testing is part of the learning process. High expectations, more time, testing. They created teamwork, creating a school that's where all the teachers and faculty act as a team, rowing in the same direction. And last, having a strong leader who can create a team atmosphere in a school like this or a school like Garfield. Those are what happened. At that point, I was sort of filled with this notion that I really needed to know more about education, and my life suddenly changed. I married the day that I graduated from college, the managing editor of my college paper, who has always been clearly a more brilliant journalist than me by a long shot. She was my competitor in China while we were raising 2 boys, breaking great stories on what was my turf. I was the China expert. And then we came back to Los Angeles, and she began to climb the ladder of editors at the Los Angeles Times, and finally hit what she saw as a glass ceiling and began to look for offers elsewhere, and got a call from Peter Jennings. Remember Peter Jennings, who was the anchor at ABC. He was looking for someone to be a senior producer for Foreign News, and he wanted Linda. And this is a true story. I'm in my kitchen, and the woman I love, who's the mother of my 3 children now, the girl I married the day I graduated from college, is on the phone with Peter Jennings, who many of you remember is not only a great journalist, but one of the most handsome men ever on television. And I think was on his 3rd wife about then, so clearly a player, as some say. And so this is a true story. He's saying to Linda, I want you. I need you. Come be with me in New York. And it's very upsetting to me and disabling. But she bought it. So suddenly we're in New York. And I wanted a job with the Washington Post. We had one job open then. It was covering Wall Street. And I told the business editor I'd be great at that job. Give me that job. I'd be terrific at it. Even though I never read our business section. I own no stock. I was vaguely aware the market went up some days and down the other, but that was the extent of, Washington Post reporters. I hope you have listened to this enough to this point, are, twice as arrogant as any reporters you'll ever meet, and I really thought that I could do a great job just by the fact that I'm me. So I did it for about, I was happy at it for a couple months. It was like, covering sports. If the Yankees won, you asked the manager what was happening. They said, well, the right-handed hitters were seeing the ball, and the left-handed hitters had a nice wind blowing toward right field, and you wrote that down carefully. It sounds like you know what you're talking about. Same thing with covering Wall Street. You talk to the stock analysts, you write carefully what they say. It sounds like you know what you're actually doing. But it wasn't feeding my soul. I wanted to write more about schools. I wanted to pursue my quest for what made a great school and how could you get schools like Garfield up to the level that we had found. I got another book contract to write a book about our best public schools. My kid was then a student, one of my sons was then a student at Scarsdale High School, a very wealthy community in New York. And the editor of the book had his kids at Greenwich High School, a wealthy community in Connecticut, and he thought people would read such a book and people who had money would buy such a book about our best public schools. And so I started researching this book, and the first thing I struck upon was the fact that my son at Scarsdale High School had to take an entrance test to be allowed to take AP U.S. History. I was used to Garfield, where they were welcoming any kid who wanted to challenge themselves into any AP course. Scarsdale, you had to pass a test to get into the course. That didn't make much sense to me. And the more I visited all these other great public high schools and some private schools around the country, I realized this was the way it worked. They didn't think their average students were good enough for AP and didn't let them take these challenging courses. Whereas at Garfield High School, I had seen average and below average students come into these courses, and because they had teachers who understood if you gave a kid enough extra time and encouragement, they would do wondrous things and learn a lot, even in a challenging course, they had wonderful success. But our best schools were only having mediocre success, so we're not really giving their average students, who are clearly better prepared for AP than the kids at Garfield, they weren't giving them a chance even to learn it. That came to me as a revelation. And at the end of my time writing this book, I came up with a way of rating high schools, which Tom just mentioned, called the Challenge Index, which is a way we had been rating schools sort of informally up to then. This is in the late 90s when I came up with this idea, by test scores. A school that had very high average test scores, everybody thought was a great school. That would certainly apply to St. Paul's. It certainly applied to Scarsdale and Greenwich and the schools that I was visiting. But most of us know, who have looked at education statistics, that those high test scores in schools like that are not a measure of how good the school is. They are a measure of how great the families are that these kids have come from. That there's an iron rule that the more money and education your parents have, the better your test score is going to be. We had no idea if those high schools were adding any value at all to what they were getting to those kids' lives. Whereas I knew one school, Garfield, which had added a lot of value to their lives by opening up AP to all. So I came up with a list that rated schools based not on their test scores, but on how many of their kids participated in AP and took AP exams. And I had this vague notion. I'd heard something about something called International Baccalaureate. And I read up on it a bit, and it sounded like sort of like AP. That's all I knew. My learning curve on IB was very slow. So I added them to the list. I counted each year how many IB or AP tests were given at your school, and I divided that by the size of your graduating senior class, so that a big school like New Trier, which graduates in Winnetka, which graduates about 900 kids a year and has lots of AP tests, if you divide, wouldn't have an advantage over a little school like Blindbrook, which graduates in New York, which graduates about 50 kids. So divide the number of tests by the number of seniors, and you get a ratio. If the ratio was 1 or above, you had more tests than students graduating, then you got on the list. That first year, I could only find 243 out of the 22,000 high schools in the United States who had a ratio of 1 or above. That the notion of challenging that many kids was alien to most American high schools, both public and private. So I, pondered this, and then my life changed again. My wife got tired of Peter Jennings. I'll tell you why if you want to come later. And said, well, it's time for us to go back to Washington. I know you want to go back to Washington. I wanted to be a regular education reporter at the Washington Post. I didn't want to be a national education reporter. I wanted to be able to get into local schools and return to them again and again so I could find out what was going on in classrooms, which I thought was the real story. So the then Metro editor sort of saw my vision for this and let me do this. And the minute I started covering local schools in Washington, all these rumors began to spread about what I was doing. And I was then 52 years old. I had been a foreign correspondent, a national correspondent, a business correspondent, the kind of people who at that age and stage in journalism suddenly find themselves back reporting on Metro in my field, in my newspaper, are generally being punished for something. I've cheated on my expense account, I've misspelled Warren Buffett's name, something really terrible like that. Or maybe he's going through a second childhood. Why is Mathews covering education? This is a true story. I actually had a publicist for a big company I knew when I was the LA bureau chief, who called up and I answered the phone and said, "Hi Jay, would you say hi to your dad, that other Jay Mathews? I knew him back in LA, and you must be his son. I see you're covering Metro, so you must be one of those young reporters." This was completely out of character. But once I started being a regular newspaper reporter, I began to see the importance of IB and began to see how important it was that we get a situation where more kids could take challenging courses, particularly courses like IB. And as Tom mentioned, I did introduce myself to the schools of the Washington area by applying the challenge index to all those schools. And after I finished that calculation, which had the highest ratio of tests to graduating seniors, the #1 school in the Washington area was a school called George Mason High School in Falls Church, Virginia, a school I had never heard of. I had been when a young reporter, I'd covered schools in the Washington area, particularly in Virginia, never heard of this high school. It's a little school in a small community, and that was an IB school. And I said, this IB thing looks interesting. Maybe I should take a look and see what they're doing. So I got them to let me to take the higher level 20th century history final exam with IB. They actually sent off to Switzerland or wherever they send these things my name and said I was 17 years old, which was the most exciting thing that happened to me in a long time. And I'd had this, but I was worried about taking this test because I had also, so I was finishing this thing, the book, I'd gone and taken the AP U.S. History exam at Mamaroneck High School in New York, which was the center of my book about AP and the Challenge Index. And I'd had this disturbing experience where, they were going to put me in the library with the other kids taking this exam so I could finally do an AP exam. When I was in high school in the 60s, they didn't have AP in my school. And at the last minute, they pulled me out of the library and put me in essentially a broom closet, sort of a storage closet, where I was all alone taking this exam. And it bothered me, and I realized what the problem was. They obviously feared if they left me in the library, some kid would turn around and see this balding 50-year-old taking the AP exam and be absolutely traumatized with the fear that he had to pass this test in order to get out of high school, and here was this guy doing it for the 40th time and still not getting through. I took the IB exam at George Mason, and it just about killed me. I had, it's a two-day exam. You guys know this, but I didn't at the time. 3 hours one day, 2 days, then 2 hours the next. I took a very long nap afterwards and began to ponder how much I didn't know about IB and how much I needed to learn. And so my life since then has been, so this is 97 when I did that, has been learning as much as I could about IB and seeing how good it is and how it is in many ways even better than AP. I'd spent a lot of time writing about AP. It has certainly revolutionized Garfield High School and a lot of other schools, but there was something about IB that took us to the next step. And I think it's important for parents and teachers in a school like this one to appreciate on a national, international perspective how good IB is and how much it is doing to take us to the next level of education, which we are sorely lacking. As many of you know, in the United States in general, we've had no significant gains in mathematics or reading scores for 17-year-olds in the last 30 years. Our high school education system is stuck, is in a slump, and it's not gotten out of it. And I think in part it's because of what I saw and when I was visiting all those great schools, not wanting to challenge their average students. Why was that? Why didn't they want to? Why were they confining AP to just their best kids? Why did that make any sense? Here's what I've learned. And if you take anything from this chat, just these points, I think, are the ones that you should remember. I've got written down 4 of the reasons why IB is the best thing for America today. Number 1, the exams are longer and deeper, and they are all, as you know, almost all essay questions. Half of AP final exams are multiple choice, half are essays. IB is all essays. This is the greatest example of the emphasis that IB puts on writing. I'll get into this in more depth, but the weakest part of American high school education today is writing. We simply don't teach it with any vigor. IB forces schools to teach writing, how kids to think clearly, to think critically, and to be able to put their thoughts into coherent prose, which is a terrific thing. And one of the reasons because they have 3 to 5 hour exams, which you're writing all the time. As I say, my hand was limp after doing that IB exam. And as you may have noticed, I was teasing the faculty here, but rather if they've been teasing the girls' school, an AP school, about what's happening in AP. You may not have noticed, but their AP is changing their exams to be just like IB exams. They're making them with more choices, more writing, so that teachers can go deeper, and that the essays that they work on will be deep. The teacher in a new AP school, class, and they're starting with the sciences, can focus on just a few subjects. And since the kid has a choice on the exam, which they don't have now in AP, but will in the new AP exams like they do in IB, you can have a much more deeper education, and you write better and have a better system. Number 2, the integration of IB with theory of knowledge, with community service, and with each courses to the other is remarkably good and useful, and allows teachers to experiment and cross borders, which you can't do in AP. Number 3, IB makes for more challenging schools. I mean, I only noticed this when I started expanding, and when the number of schools on the challenge index, my annual ratings of schools began to expand. It went from 243 that first year to about 400 the next year. In the most recent year, 2012, for which we used 2011 data, we have more than 2,000 schools that have reached that ratio of at least as many AP or IB exams as graduating seniors. That's still only 10% of American high schools, but it's a lot. And when you look at where the IB schools, it's remarkable. For many of the last few years, at least half of the top 10 schools have been IB schools. In the top 100 schools, about 7% have been IB schools, when IB only represents about 2% of American high schools. So there's something about IB that presents a much higher chance of challenge than AP, if you're looking at it in that sense, and I think that's important to note. And last but not least, and I cannot overemphasize this, the extended essay, which IB diploma candidates do, is, based on the testimony of every IB student I've ever interviewed, the most satisfying intellectually, emotionally, and academically experience there is for American high school students today. Writing a 4,000-word essay, a research essay, is so different than what schools demand these days, is so keyed into what colleges demand, and is so satisfying to a student who wants to really learn something and show how much he can find in the world. And it's so key to their falling in love with learning, which is what we want all kids to do, that is absolutely the premier thing happening in high schools today. And sadly, if you go beyond IB schools and beyond some private schools, which also emphasize some kind of project in the end of the year, no American high schools, certainly no public American high schools except IB schools, require that many kids to write a long research essay. It's simply not in the cards. It's too hard to grade. It's too hard to organize. My daughter, who went to Sidwell Friends, did have a senior project, but they soften the edges there a bit, which Sidwell does, and I'll talk more about that. So instead of writing anything, she and her partner built a newspaper rack for the school. Now, I thought that was interesting. My wife had an editor at USA Today where she was working, who was a carpenter, and he helped her with it. And I thought it was great for somebody in my family to do something practical like carpentry, but it was not an academic experience, and I think that's what kids really hanker for at that age. So those are the 4 things. IB exams are better, the integration is better, they produce better, more challenging schools, and the extended essay is the best thing I've ever seen in high schools. And one other tribute to the extended essay. Here's a recent public press release from the College Board about AP, announcing something called the AP Cambridge Capstone Program, which will include a seminar on developing inquiry skills through writing, researching, and team projects by exploring a specific topic of global relevance, which will lead to a research project, which culminates in a 4,000 to 5,000 word academic paper, which enables students to develop practical skills in research methodology and the skills to manage a sustained piece of academic work. This is the AP program, essentially stealing the extended essay. If that isn't a compliment for IB, I don't know what is. That is a sign of what you have here, what your kids are doing, and great numbers of them now are doing, is absolutely magnificent, not only for their lives, but for our country, to set an example for how many schools who don't understand how good our kids are and how much they can do if they give them enough of a challenge to challenge them and to bring them up to the next level. Let me put in a word about college admissions. People often ask, well, you know, isn't AP better for college admissions? And it's not the case. I've talked to, you know, scores of college admissions people in our most selective schools. If your son comes in from St. Paul's School having taken 4 IB tests and has 4 IB exams but does not have the diploma, and he is stacked up against a student from, I don't know, Marshall High School in Fairfax County who has taken 4 AP tests and exams, they are right at the same level. Not having the IB diploma is not an issue if they have as many courses and exams as IB as they have in AP. College admissions offices love AP, they love IB, and I think they mostly like IB a little bit better because they know of the strengths that I've just described, and will tell you about it if you ask them. So IB does deliver, and it does. You don't need to be. It delivers everything you need to be not only ready for college, but ready to compete in life, to be able to write, to be able to understand, to be able to do the kind of things that we want our kids to be able to do. There is a problem with IB credit, many of you are aware of. Many colleges, if you do not have the IB diploma, will not officially count or give you credit for your standard level IB courses if you have any. There are not very many students coming from this school that come out with just standard level credits for which they want credit, but that is even changing. The University of Maryland, among others, is one of the first to change that rather inexplicable discriminatory policy based on notions about IB that are 30 years out of date. And they are giving credit for standard level, and many more are. So if you hear egregious cases of that happening, call me, and I'll write another one of my columns about this. I've been ranting about this for some time. It shows how stupid the colleges are and how they haven't geared themselves up to understand how good IB is, but they're getting there. I think you've discovered at St. Paul's what I did in terms of my journey in looking at high schools these days and what is challenging, what is not. Your teachers here are asking your kids to do things that very few other schools would ask them to do, and your students are responding. Most of our schools, even our best schools, don't do that. Lynn and I had an experience when Katie was just starting at Sidwell Friends in the 7th grade, which showed you the mindset that you find in I think, most of the great schools in our country, even ones as famous as Sidwell. Now, I have to confess, Lynn and I are sort of what teachers consider parents from hell, you know. We pay attention to what kind of assignments our kid is getting. We have had very high aspirations for our kids. And we were noticing that after we asked a lot of intrusive questions that our daughter just barely stand answer, that she wasn't in the top math class. She had gotten nothing but A's at her previous school, which was the Scarsdale Middle School, which is a pretty good public school. Her tests on the SSAT test in math were very high. Why wasn't she in the top math class? I mean, I had this, iron conclusion that all my kids were going to take AP Calculus. I'd written a book about AP Calculus, and it occurred to me once I asked a lot of questions, intrusive questions, that she was not on the track to take AP Calculus by the time she got out of Sidwell Friends. So we had a meeting. And the teachers are nice and they're very honest. They'll always give you the straight answer. And in the course of this meeting, it turned out that they thought their answer was, well, Katie is very good at writing and reading. She loves literature. She's obviously a liberal arts student. And we just thought she wouldn't be comfortable in the fast math class. And the word comfortable kept coming again and again. And Linda could see steam building up inside me. I was going to explode at some point and yell at them, I don't want my child to be comfortable. I want her to learn as much as possible in your school. But I kept, I calmed down, obviously. And they were good educators. They realized that, it was hard not to see that she was capable of doing this. So they moved her up. The teacher gave her more exercises. She moved up to the faster math class, and she did indeed take AP Calculus at the end of the year. But throughout that time, the math department of the Sidwell Friends School looked at me as sort of the enemy. I mean, I was writing about AP all the time, and I may have dropped a few remarks and columns about this cult of comfiness at places like Sidwell. But I think that's the problem. I mean, if we find that at Sidwell Friends School, think of what it is like as the vast majority of American high schools that don't have that reputation, don't have teachers that skilled. Everybody wants to keep our kids comfy. It's not a good instinct. Here at St. Paul's, you have a school, I sense the kids are very comfortable, but not too comfortable. You want them to be able to say when they get out of high school, that is a high school that gave me something that I can deal with. Where they want them to be able to finish up saying, I've written something or done something I'm proud of that's added value to my life and makes me readier for life and for college. That's what you've done here. So I think you should celebrate the fact that you're at a school that has taken that leap forward. And like me, and like all the other parents and reporters out there, keep exploring, keep watching. If you see some stories, give me a call. And congratulate yourselves for being at such a good school that has taken the great creative risk of making sure your kids learn and are as excited about learning as you want them to be. Thank you very much. Now, we had a little time for a question. If this was tomorrow, I'd cut it off right away because I can't miss the Big Bang Theory, but it's only Wednesday night. So anybody want to ask anything? Yes, right in the back, this gentleman.
Is there any empirical evidence that colleges are actually starting to give some preferential treatment to the IB testing protocol as opposed to just kind of an instinct that they're starting to? And also, why in Geneva does the board sit or stand idly while colleges here refuse to accept their credits?
Very good question. I think the answer to your first question is no. I know of no empirical evidence that these policies are changing. They say they are changing. I've interviewed admissions directors and provosts in about 16 schools around the Washington metropolitan area, and a few have told me they have changed their rules. Most are still unclear about this. So we're at the beginning. They passed a law in Virginia, they say, that made it absolutely mandatory that they not discriminate in SL, and I think that is changing some policies, but we're talking about universities that are very crusty and slow-moving. So I think, keep in mind, if your child is in that situation, has an SL course that they deserve credit for, there are, and it has been done here, John Thorpe told me, if you're faced with that obstacle, the kid simply takes the college's placement test. If they've got the goods to go to the next jump, then they can take that. And if they do well, then they can avoid the course that they've already taken. Or talk to the professor. Professors love to find kids who are ahead of the game and will, if they have a conversation and realize what they've done, then they can go ahead. As far as IB, I think the problem with IB, and the power center is not in Europe, but in Bethesda, where IB North America is now based. And I think the problem is that IB, those people do not want to annoy the colleges. They don't have the great power of the college board in which all these colleges are members to sort of throw their weight around and say, you will do this, you will do that. They have to encourage by friendly persuasion. And so they have been not as obstreperous as I have been about telling the colleges that they're completely out of line and are discriminating against bright kids and hurting them. I think they're getting better at it, and John told me he thinks he sees them. And John Thorpe is an amazing resource for an IB director. He was back at the beginning of the program. He knows a lot of the great heroes of IB, and is very good to talk to if you have a problem like that. In the case of one of your kids, anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Are you sure? Well, which high school did you go to? Okay. Uh, did you check at the time to see if this? I think the studio art AP course did exist. Oh, you're talking about IB now. You're talking about IB? Okay, IB now. I think that is. I think there is some room for art electives, even in IB. We certainly have room now for high-tech electives. I mean, Mick was explaining to me how you can do a high-tech elective that doesn't involve quite the same things. But I think that's something, the possibility of electives in IB is so much wider than it is in AP. I think that's something you can push for. But it's usually something that you have to do at the individual school level. Get them persuaded to seek permission to teach something that is not a standard course. And then if you push there, IB seems to be terribly receptive to taking electives that schools think are good for them. But you're right. That's one of the places where IB is weak, and they don't have the established tradition of a studio art course. So I think if you talk to John about that, things that you can do to get IB generalized, they're now down in Bethesda, and I think they'd be delighted to hear if they had a school that was really pushing for that. I think they'd do something about it. Yes? Oh, that's good. One of my editors told me to write, or asked me to write a story about this very subject, about how you can get IB and AP, both arts and music. So that's a very good thing to keep in mind. Anybody else? Yes, right there. Yeah, I think if you look at an IB syllabus, you'll find most of the course titles have great meaning to you. Generally, they teach. This is a program that's set for 11th and 12th graders. There are IB courses in all the basic sciences, in every social studies topic that you would find in an ordinary high school program, and many more. Certainly in all the major languages, English, as a matter of course, math, and the sequences are pretty close to what you would find in an AP school or any other kind of school. So it's not, and the courses are taught at a higher level, particularly in terms of the amount of writing that is demanded, the amount of thought and critical thinking is demanded. They are taught closer to how introductory college courses are taught in the very best colleges, where professors are in charge of smaller courses and there's a lot more thinking and writing than you find in big state universities, where the AP course is more likely what you find in those courses. But indeed, it's not anything that you would find unfamiliar. It's just at a higher level and there's a lot more writing. Anybody else? Yes, sir. It's a very good question. It's about, what's going on with boys and girls. Well, my wife calls me an eternal optimist. Actually, she calls me the what is the word we use? The Pollyanna in hell. That's me. So I'm always seeing the good side of things. I think this is a good news story. What we're saying is that girls have been freed from a long tradition of low expectations. And we now expect things for girls that we used to expect just from boys. So they have college admissions that they didn't used to have. They have more attention from teachers than they used to have. And this is a worldwide phenomenon, by the way. We're finding it not only in this country, but all over the world. The rise of young women academically is a world story, a great story for our species, and we should celebrate. I think also the fact that there are more women in college now is in large part because we have so many women returning to college. So much of that gap is because of the large number of women who didn't finish their education and got married and had children and are coming back. So that makes a difference. But we do have, particularly in working class neighborhoods, a problem with boys seeing academic work as not interesting, not useful to them, not leading them in the right places. That is changing also, although we have to work on it hard. My last book was about the KIPP schools, this wonderfully successful group of schools for low-income kids around the country, and they have found all kinds of ways. The two founders were these big, crazy, sports nutty Ivy League graduates who wanted to motivate boys more than others, and they're finding ways to motivate those boys in ways we've never seen before, and that's something we're working on. But I think by most rights, certainly boys in this country aren't doing worse than they did in the past. Boys in the kind of communities I'm looking at here are doing just as great as they always have, and we'll get them back up to the level of girls, I think, before long. Yes? I'm sorry, say that one more time. Yes, I mean the Prince Charles's colleges, but yeah, I mean those are part of the IB movement. They're very good. They're very demanding. They have the sort of same tradition you'll find in all IB schools, Washington International School, in Washington, but with a little more muscle. I have never visited one. I don't know much more about them, but that they follow the IB curriculum and they're very forceful and character driven and good places to be. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Well, it's an interesting question. I think testing is simply a part of learning. We've been testing students for, since civilization began, since we first had universities. And we had tests when Socrates was around, having dialogues. They are a part of the learning process. We've always had tests. Before we had standardized tests, we had teachers' tests. I would argue that the standardized tests we have now are actually better than the teachers' tests we had before because they are the reflection of what teachers throughout our communities or our states think are most important things to be learned. And they protect us from teachers who, have a bad year and decide just to sort of phone it in and don't test very well and don't test on things they haven't taught very well. So I welcome standardized tests as a way to make sure that all teachers and all classes are working at the same level. The standardized tests that we have, on a state level are sort of lowbrow in some ways. Multiple choice questions, we can't afford much more than that, but I think we've always had multiple choice questions long before we had standardized, so I think they are a slight improvement over what we had before. When we get to a situation where you have an IB exam, which is all thought and writing, 3 hours through 5 hours long, I can't think of anything better than that. I can think of a few things better than that, but that is something that you would want to teach to. How do you teach to it? You have kids think and write and analyze. I don't think it enriches the learning process. There are some schools now that have gone to the equivalent of PhD oral exams for high school students. There's a woman named Deborah Myers who created a school in East Harlem which did that and is famous for having that kind of an exam. I think that's a great idea. If we can move to that kind of an exam, that would be at least as good as, perhaps in some ways better, than written exams. You have just stand the kid in front of a panel and ask them a lot of questions, as Socrates did. But you know, given what you can expect from what human beings can create in a large organization, I think the kind of teaching the tests you find in AB and IB, and to a certain extent AP, is much better than we could readily expect, and we should embrace it. And if we got some great educators who want to go to general exams, other ways to test, that'd be fine. But I think testing is necessary. You don't learn unless you test. Yes.
I'm coming from a public school perspective with regard to the Common Core
Mm-hmm.
and the integration of Common Core with IB, because I'm seeing in my school system many schools are starting to adopt IB curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
and yet we still have out there the Common Core, which is what the United States is hoping everybody will adopt. Our school system has already adopted it, and so how do the two integrate?
Well, you've just given me a story idea. Thank you very much. My column tomorrow is about the Common Core and the growing battle between people who like the fact that Common Core is going to require more nonfiction reading, and English teachers and others who think that's really not a good way to go, that good fiction should still hold that. But I had not thought about the great point you raised. My initial reaction is the Common Core sounds hot and great, and it's more demanding than what we have now for state tests, but it's still way below the level of IB. And so you can teach your IB class, and your kids are going to still ace the Common Core because they're based on the same general principles and the same high level, and they're going to get a lot more because they're going to be writing a lot more. That is my initial reaction, but you have now inspired me to go actually ask some good questions about this. Thank you very much. One more question? I'm trying to see a hand. Right, somebody out front. Did I miss somebody? The gentleman in the back.
The IB initiative is very lively within our strategic planning. And so my question is that as we look at future career channels for graduates from college, with a lot of them going into the technical skills, math and sciences, computers, coders, developers, etc., are we at risk of having the extended essay, which is at the heart of the IB program? Is that extended essay truly going to remain relevant in those math and science curriculum of the future?
Well, I think you should have a long conversation with Mick Scott. I had a short one today, and he made it clear to me that there is all kinds of things you can do with the extended essay in a technical STEM-sized. I mean, he talked to me about, he had his kids at the STEM club doing robotics and writing programs for robotics, and how you could. He says you can indeed. He'd already constructed in his own mind an extended essay topic would be making the robot and then writing how you did that and what problems you overcame. I think the mighty current wave of STEM is washing over this country and over education. If you say the magic word STEM, immediately 18 people want to give you a grant. I think that there's no program of its size that is better than IB at both getting to the heart of the learning at the highest level and being flexible enough to take what's going on coming in new. So I think IB is a great place to push, and the fact that you've got somebody like Mick at this school is an enormous plus for St. Paul's. So I congratulate you, and I've gotten his number, and I'm going to be calling him about stories in the future. Thank you very much.